"You cannot weaponize a black hole," the alien physicist shouted, slamming both hands onto the polished conference table as if the accusation itself could rewrite the laws of the universe. Every camera inside the grand hall turned toward the lone human sitting quietly at the end of the room. Nathan Brooks did not argue. He did not roll his eyes. He did not even bother looking offended. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folded the corner of his notebook, and let the smallest hint of a smile cross his face. That smile would haunt the galaxy for generations. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Scientific Council floated above the crystalline atmosphere of Helios Prime, a station built not for war, but for ideas. Its massive circular chamber overlooked a sea of stars through transparent alloy walls stretching nearly 200 feet high. Representatives from more than 300 civilizations filled the ascending rows, wearing robes, armor, exoskeletons, and ceremonial uniforms that reflected thousands of years of scientific prestige. Humanity had only occupied one of those seats for 23 years. Most still considered Earth an ambitious newcomer with decent engineers and impressive manufacturing, but hardly a civilization capable of challenging the oldest minds in known space. A glowing holographic title hovered over the center platform. Event Horizon Stabilization Project. Whispering spread across the chamber almost immediately. Some delegates laughed openly. Others exchanged amused looks with colleagues who had spent entire careers studying gravitational mechanics. One elderly alien with silver scales adjusted the lenses over his 4 eyes and chuckled into his translator. "Typical humans," he muttered. "If they cannot solve a problem, they rename it until it sounds impressive." More laughter followed. Nathan remained perfectly still. He was 39 years old, wearing a plain charcoal suit purchased off the rack in Seattle before boarding the diplomatic transport. No medals decorated his jacket. No famous academic titles followed his name. He looked less like the lead engineer of Earth's newest research initiative and more like the neighbor who helped fix your garage door on weekends. Council moderator Lyron cleared his throat. "Engineer Brooks, before this presentation proceeds, several senior members have requested clarification. Your proposal appears to claim that controlled gravitational singularities may have practical defensive applications." Nathan nodded once. "That is correct." Another wave of murmurs swept through the room. Professor Zarvek, widely regarded as the greatest gravitational theorist in the Orion Arm, rose slowly from his seat. His species had mapped black holes before humanity had invented written language. "Engineer Brooks," he said with measured patience, "every civilization represented here has studied singularities for thousands of years. They consume. They distort. They cannot be directed, contained, or repurposed. Suggesting otherwise is not innovation. It is fantasy." Nathan looked directly at him. "I understand why you believe that." Zarvek frowned. "Believe? Young man, this is settled physics." Nathan's smile returned, almost invisible. Sometimes settled physics is simply physics that nobody has challenged in a long time. The chamber grew noticeably quieter. Somewhere above, autonomous recording drones repositioned themselves for a better angle. Journalists leaned forward. Students watching the live broadcast across dozens of worlds stopped chatting. Even those who expected another embarrassing human publicity stunt sensed that something felt different. Nathan never tried to convince anyone they were wrong. He simply opened a weathered notebook, wrote today's date in neat handwriting, closed it again, and rested both hands on the table. "If your demonstration fails," one council member called out, "Earth's research privileges will be suspended." Nathan nodded. "Fair enough. And if you're correct?" another delegate asked with an uneasy laugh. Nathan looked through the transparent wall toward the endless field of stars beyond the station. "Then the universe has been trying to teach us something," he said quietly. "We just haven't been listening." No one applauded. No one laughed this time. For the first time since humanity joined the council, the loudest room in the galaxy became completely silent. Nathan Brooks had never planned to become the face of anything. 5 months before the hearing on Helios Prime, nobody outside a small research facility in western Montana had ever heard his name. His office overlooked a quiet valley where the loudest sound most mornings was the wind pushing through pine trees. The building itself looked more like an aging power station than one of Earth's most classified laboratories. Visitors expecting gleaming towers and polished glass usually drove right past it. That was exactly how Nathan liked it. Every morning he arrived at 7:30 with the same dented stainless steel coffee mug, greeted the security guard by name, and walked straight to Laboratory 4. He rarely talked before his second cup of coffee. His coworkers joked that they could measure the strength of Earth's gravitational field by how little Nathan smiled before 9 o'clock. Most of them had worked together for years. Maria Alvarez handled field calibration. Daniel Cooper designed containment hardware. Grace Holloway managed computational modeling. They argued constantly, laughed often, and treated impossible equations the way other people argued about baseball scores. One rainy Tuesday morning, Maria tossed a data tablet onto Nathan's desk. "Tell me I am reading this wrong." Nathan glanced at the screen while stirring cream into his coffee. "You probably are." She folded her arms. "The council just published another review. They officially declared singularity stabilization permanently impossible." Nathan quietly kept reading. Daniel leaned against the doorway. "They did not just say impossible. They said any civilization claiming otherwise should lose scientific certification." Grace walked in carrying a stack of printed reports. "That is basically a public warning aimed directly at us." Nathan finally looked up. "Did they read our research?" Grace shrugged. "Probably not." Nathan nodded once. "Then it is just another opinion." Maria laughed in disbelief. "Nathan, they practically called us amateurs." He slid the tablet back across the desk. "No, they called an idea impossible. That is different." Daniel shook his head. "Does it bother you that the smartest people in the galaxy think you are wasting your life?" Nathan looked toward the observation window where a network of enormous superconducting rings stretched across the valley floor, disappearing into reinforced concrete structures built half underground. Years of work rested behind those walls. Thousands of failed simulations. Endless redesigns. Countless nights when every calculation seemed determined to prove everyone else right. "You know what my grandfather used to tell me?" Nathan asked. Nobody answered. He smiled slightly. He fixed diesel engines for 40 years. Whenever somebody said a machine could not be repaired, he always asked the same question. "Did the machine tell you that, or did another mechanic?" Maria chuckled. "That sounds exactly like something your grandfather would say." Nathan picked up a grease pencil and began sketching circles across the whiteboard instead of using expensive holographic displays. "Physics has never lied to us. We just keep assuming we have already asked all the right questions." Grace studied the drawing. "You still think gravity can be shaped without fighting it?" "I do not think," Nathan replied calmly. "I measured something last Thursday that should not exist if the textbooks are complete." The room fell quiet. Daniel stepped closer. "You never told us." Nathan reached into a drawer and placed a tiny storage drive on the table. "Because I wanted to repeat the test 6 more times before anyone celebrated." Maria stared at him. "And?" Nathan met each of their eyes before answering. Every result matched within 0.002%. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Outside the laboratory, the clouds slowly drifted across the Montana sky, while dozens of technicians continued their ordinary work, completely unaware that inside Laboratory 4, one ordinary engineer had just quietly opened a door that every civilization in history had believed was permanently locked. 3 days after the 7th successful test, an official transport from the Galactic Scientific Council settled onto the landing pad outside Laboratory 4 without warning. Its polished silver hull reflected the Montana mountains like a mirror, making the ship look completely out of place against the pine trees and concrete buildings. Nathan watched through the observation window while sipping another cup of coffee. "They are early," Grace said quietly. Daniel looked at the security monitors and sighed. "They did not come all the way from Helios Prime to congratulate us." Maria folded her arms. "No kidding." The laboratory director, Walter Hayes, hurried into the room carrying a printed authorization packet. Everyone listened carefully. This is not a routine inspection. They requested unrestricted access to every gravity experiment on the property. Nathan looked up from his notes. "Did they provide legal authority?" Walter hesitated. "Technically, they requested cooperation." Nathan nodded. "Then we cooperate." 20 minutes later, 6 council inspectors entered Laboratory 4 wearing spotless white research uniforms trimmed with deep blue insignias. Their leader introduced herself as Senior Examiner Celine Varek, a respected astrophysicist whose published work every student on Earth had been required to study. She offered a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "Engineer Brooks," she said, extending one elegant hand. "Your reputation has spread surprisingly quickly." Nathan shook her hand. Reputations usually travel faster than facts. Celine ignored the remark. "We understand your team has reported unusual gravitational behavior. We observed repeatable measurements," Nathan answered. "That is all we have claimed." One of the younger inspectors laughed softly. "Your proposal certainly reads with more confidence than that." Nathan simply shrugged. Data should speak louder than adjectives. The inspection lasted nearly 9 hours. Every laboratory was opened. Every simulation was reviewed. Every energy log was copied. The inspectors examined cooling systems, magnetic arrays, quantum processors, and containment rings with almost obsessive attention. They expected to uncover some hidden antimatter reactor or classified military prototype. Instead, they found ordinary equipment, carefully maintained, with nothing dramatic to photograph. Late that afternoon, Celine stood inside the central control room studying another screen full of equations. "There has to be an external energy source," she murmured. Grace smiled politely. "There is." Celine looked up immediately. "Where?" Grace pointed toward the observation window. "The universe." Daniel almost laughed, but caught himself just in time. Celine frowned. "Cute answer." Nathan finally stepped beside her. "It also happens to be the correct one." The lead inspector turned toward him. "Engineer Brooks, let me save both of us some time. We know you are intelligent. We know humanity enjoys unconventional engineering. But your own reports imply controllable curvature amplification beyond accepted limits. That cannot happen." Nathan looked at the equations on the screen instead of at her. "Have you tried reproducing the measurements?" "We do not need to," Celine replied confidently. "Theoretical constraints already exclude them." Nathan nodded slowly. "So you rejected the observation before repeating the experiment." For the first time all day, Celine seemed slightly irritated. "Science is not guessing. Neither is measurement," Nathan answered. Silence settled over the control room. Finally, the inspectors completed their review and prepared their official findings. Before leaving, Celine handed Walter Hayes a digital report. No prohibited technology detected. No evidence of weapon development. Experimental conclusions remained scientifically unsupported. Walter thanked her politely. The shuttle lifted into the evening sky and disappeared beyond the clouds. Maria waited until it became a tiny silver before speaking. "They think we failed." Nathan picked up his notebook and slipped it into his backpack. "Good." Daniel blinked. "Good." Nathan smiled to himself as he walked toward the main laboratory doors. The safest time to finish building something extraordinary is when everyone else has already convinced themselves it cannot possibly work. Nathan arrived before sunrise the next morning, long before the rest of the team. The laboratory parking lot was still empty, the mountain air crisp enough to leave a thin layer of frost on the handrails outside the entrance. He unlocked Laboratory 4, poured himself fresh coffee, and stood alone in front of the main observation window. Beyond the reinforced glass, 3 massive superconducting rings stretched across the valley, their surfaces barely visible beneath low morning fog. They looked ordinary, almost disappointing, which was exactly how Nathan wanted them to look. Extraordinary machines rarely advertised themselves. At precisely 7:45, Maria walked in carrying 2 breakfast sandwiches. "You slept here again, did you not?" Nathan accepted one with a grateful smile. "The couch is surprisingly comfortable after 14 hours of debugging." Daniel followed a minute later, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Tell me we are finally running the full sequence." Nathan checked the clock on the wall. 9 o'clock. No sooner. Grace entered last, balancing a stack of diagnostic reports against her shoulder. "Every sensor has been recalibrated twice. If anything drifts more than 1/1000th, we will see it." Nathan nodded. "Good. Today we stop asking whether the math is correct. Today we find out whether nature agrees." The control room gradually filled with the quiet sounds of preparation. Cooling pumps reached operating temperature. Diagnostic displays flickered to life. Thousands of green status lights slowly replaced the amber warnings that always appeared during startup. Nobody rushed. Nobody celebrated. Years of engineering had taught them that confidence came after measurements, never before. At exactly 9 o'clock, Nathan rested one hand over the primary activation panel. "Begin stage 1. Maria acknowledged the command. Stage 1 online. Daniel monitored power flow. Containment rings stable. Grace watched a wall of equations updating in real time. Computational synchronization holding at 100%. Nathan pressed the switch. Nothing happened. At least, nothing obvious. No dramatic flash filled the room. No rumble shook the valley. The giant rings outside remained perfectly still beneath the morning sun. Daniel frowned. If somebody walked in right now, they would think the machine is off. Nathan smiled faintly. That is because they would be looking in the wrong place. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then Grace leaned closer to her monitor. Nathan, I see it. Maria turned toward them. What? Grace pointed at the data stream. Orbital calibration satellite 12 just reported a position shift. Daniel shook his head. Impossible. That satellite is almost 18,000 miles away. Grace refreshed the display. 0.4 millimeters. Nathan remained calm. Check satellite 19. 0.41. Satellite 27. 0.39. Daniel slowly lowered his headset. All three moved. Nathan looked through the observation window, toward the quiet valley, where nothing appeared different. Not moved, he corrected gently. Their measurements changed because space itself adjusted. Nobody spoke. Grace continued reading incoming reports. Ground sensors in Wyoming just detected the same pattern. Another alert appeared. Then another. Then another. Tiny numbers. Barely measurable. Completely repeatable. Maria whispered, almost to herself. We are not pushing anything. No, Nathan answered. We are persuading it. Half an hour later, additional telemetry arrived from civilian observatories that had no idea they were participating in history. Their instruments confirmed the same microscopic distortions with completely independent equipment. The room grew very quiet. Daniel stared at the scrolling data. This is going to spread beyond Earth, is not it? Nathan closed his notebook after writing one final observation. Eventually, Maria looked at him. Should we notify the council now? Nathan shook his head. Not yet. Grace looked surprised. Why wait? Nathan walked toward the window once more, watching sunlight break through the clouds over the mountains. Because right now they still believe gravity is something that only happens to them. He paused for a moment before adding softly. Soon they are going to discover it can also be invited. By the second week, the numbers had grown too large to ignore. Freight captains crossing the outer lanes of the Seoul Trade Network began filing routine navigation reports about tiny course corrections they could not explain. None of them described an emergency. None of them reported damaged systems. Their ships simply arrived a few inches off their predicted approach vectors, forcing onboard computers to make minor adjustments before docking. Under normal circumstances, nobody would have cared. Space was full of small uncertainties. But hundreds of identical reports arriving within days of each other caught the attention of observatories far beyond Earth. On Helios Prime, the Department of Gravitational Observation quietly opened an internal review. Professor Zarvek sat at the head of a circular briefing room, while dozens of researchers studied holographic star maps floating above the table. Bright blue lines traced commercial hyperlanes through nearby sectors. Every few minutes, another route shifted by a fraction of a degree. One analyst frowned. The deviations remained statistically insignificant. Another scientist nodded. Individually, yes. Collectively, they should not exist. Zarvek folded his hands. Equipment malfunction? We checked observatories from 19 civilizations. Different hardware, different software, different calibration methods. The pattern is identical. Someone in the back of the room hesitated before speaking. There is one common variable. Zarvek looked up. Continue. The younger researcher expanded another display. At the center appeared a small yellow star labeled Sol. Several nearby sectors glowed faintly with overlapping gravity maps. Every anomaly originates somewhere within the Terran sphere of influence. The room grew noticeably quieter. Another council member dismissed the suggestion with a wave of his hand. Correlation is not causation. Agreed, the analyst replied. But the timing began less than 48 hours after Brooks's laboratory resumed full operations. Zarvek leaned back without answering. Across the galaxy, Nathan Brooks was completely unaware of the discussion. His morning looked exactly like every other Tuesday. He spent an hour replacing a faulty coolant valve, answered 3 electronic maintenance requests, and argued with Daniel over whether the cafeteria coffee had somehow become even worse than last month. Maria laughed while pouring another cup. If our greatest scientific breakthrough ends because everybody quits over terrible coffee, history is going to judge us very harshly. Nathan smiled. History usually ignores the coffee. Grace walked into the room carrying fresh orbital telemetry. History may not, but this definitely will. She projected a map across the conference table. Tiny green markers slowly expanded outward from Earth like ripples spreading across a calm lake. Daniel stared at it. The field is growing. Very slowly, Grace answered. But it has expanded another 93,000 miles since yesterday. Nathan studied the numbers without showing much emotion. Expected. Maria looked at him. You expected it to keep expanding on its own? Not expanding, Nathan corrected gently. Balancing. Before anyone could ask another question, the laboratory communications console chimed. Walter Hayes appeared on the main screen, looking far more serious than usual. Nathan, I just received an encrypted message from Earth's diplomatic office. Nathan set his coffee down. What happened? Walter exhaled slowly. The Galactic Scientific Council has scheduled an emergency symposium. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Already? Walter nodded. Officially, they are calling it a review of unexplained gravitational observations. Maria exchanged a glance with Grace. Nobody needed to say what everyone was thinking. Nathan remained surprisingly calm. When? Tomorrow morning, Earth time. Walter paused before adding one final sentence. They specifically requested that engineer Nathan Brooks attend in person. The room fell silent. Nathan looked once more through the laboratory window toward the quiet valley outside. The mountains had not changed. The pine trees still swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Yet somewhere beyond those clouds, the oldest scientific institutions in the galaxy had finally noticed that the universe was beginning to behave in ways they could no longer explain. Nathan arrived at the Galactic Scientific Council the following morning carrying the same worn leather notebook and the same stainless steel coffee mug he had used every day for years. The contrast between him and the towering council complex could not have been greater. The chamber shimmered with polished crystal pillars, floating displays, and intricate gravity sculptures that slowly rotated above the delegates. Every detail had been designed to remind visitors they were standing inside the intellectual center of the galaxy. Nathan barely looked around. He quietly took his assigned seat, while dozens of alien scientists whispered among themselves. Professor Zarvek sat near the front, his expression unreadable. Senior Examiner Celine Varek glanced toward Nathan before returning to her datapad. Council Moderator Lyron struck the floor once with a ceremonial staff. This emergency symposium is now in session. During the past 12 standard days, gravitational inconsistencies have appeared across multiple navigation sectors. Preliminary investigations have failed to identify any natural explanation. A large holographic map illuminated the room. Hundreds of tiny blue markers floated through nearby star systems, each representing a verified anomaly. None were dangerous. None had damaged ships or stations. Yet together they formed a pattern impossible to dismiss. Lyron continued. Engineer Nathan Brooks, multiple reports associate these observations with your recent research. You have been invited to explain whether humanity possesses relevant information. Every eye in the chamber settled on Nathan. He stood calmly, buttoned his jacket, and spoke in the same relaxed voice he used back home during engineering meetings. Yes. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Lyron raised an eyebrow. You acknowledge responsibility? Nathan shook his head. Responsibility is not the same thing as cause. We observed the phenomenon before anyone else. We did not create gravity. Professor Zarvek leaned forward. Then explain what we are seeing. Nathan reached into his notebook and removed a small storage drive. An assistant connected it to the central projector. Instead of displaying complicated equations, the screen showed a simple animation. A marble rolled across a stretched fabric surface before gently settling into a stable orbit around a shallow depression. Nathan looked around the chamber. Every civilization represented here has spent thousands of years studying the whole. He paused for a moment. Humanity decided to study the fabric. Several delegates exchanged confused looks. One researcher actually laughed. This is a children's classroom demonstration. Nathan nodded. Exactly. Sometimes the simplest model survives because everyone assumes it has already taught us everything. He tapped the display once more. The animation changed. Instead of placing the marble into the depression, invisible waves slowly reshaped the fabric itself. The marble changed direction without ever touching the center. Silence spread through the chamber. Nathan continued, "You have always treated extreme gravity as an object. We approached it as geometry." Professor Zarvek frowned. "Geometry cannot redirect singularities." Nathan answered without hesitation. "Neither can force." Another council scientist stood abruptly. "Are you claiming your laboratory altered space-time on demand?" Nathan met his eyes. "No." The room seemed to relax for a brief moment. Then Nathan finished his sentence. "I am saying we learned how to encourage space-time to adjust itself." Nobody laughed this time. Lyron slowly folded his hands. "Engineer Brooks, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." Nathan smiled politely and looked toward the enormous transparent wall overlooking the stars beyond Helios Prime. "I agree completely." He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small handheld control device no larger than a television remote. "Which is why I brought a demonstration." Across the chamber, several council security officers instinctively glanced at one another, uncertain whether they should intervene. Nathan never moved from his place. He simply rested one finger above the single activation button, while the quiet inside the grand hall became so complete that even the faint hum of the station's life support system suddenly seemed impossibly loud. Nathan pressed the button. Nothing flashed. No alarm sounded. The control device did not glow, vibrate, or project a hologram. It simply transmitted a secure signal across millions of miles to Laboratory 4 back on Earth. For several long seconds, absolutely nothing appeared to happen. A few delegates exchanged skeptical smiles. One council member quietly leaned toward another and whispered, "I expected more theater." Professor Zarvek kept his eyes on Nathan instead. "Is this the demonstration?" he asked. Nathan nodded. "It has already begun." Before anyone could respond, the massive star map suspended above the chamber flickered. A soft chime echoed through the room as the council's navigation network automatically refreshed its live astronomical data. One bright shipping corridor near the edge of the Sol sector curved by a fraction of a degree. Then another. Then a third. The changes were tiny, barely noticeable unless someone had spent decades studying orbital mechanics. Every scientist in the room noticed immediately. Senior Examiner Celine Varek looked down at her tablet. "These are live telemetry updates." An assistant answered without taking his eyes off the display. "Confirmed. Multiple civilian observatories are reporting identical measurements." Another chime interrupted him. Then another. More gravity monitoring stations from independent civilizations began uploading fresh readings. Every one of them agreed. Space itself was quietly changing shape. Lyron stood from his chair. "Display local sector overlays." The holographic map expanded until dozens of neighboring star systems filled the chamber. Thin blue navigation lines bent almost imperceptibly around a single invisible point somewhere beyond Earth's outer colonies. One young researcher stared at the projection in disbelief. "There is no detectable mass there." Nathan answered calmly. "Correct. Then what is bending the routes?" Nathan looked at him with the same patient expression he used when explaining equipment to new interns back in Montana. "The routes are responding to a controlled gradient." Professor Zarvek slowly walked toward the center display. "You are saying empty space now contains a stable gravitational preference." "That is one way to describe it." "Without a singularity?" Nathan nodded. "Without transporting one." Murmurs filled the chamber again, but they sounded different now. Nobody was laughing anymore. Scientists hurried between consoles comparing independent observations. Some called distant observatories. Others recalculated equations they had considered settled for centuries. One elderly delegate quietly removed his glasses and cleaned them twice before looking back at the projection, as though clearer lenses might restore the universe to its previous state. Celine looked directly at Nathan. "This cannot be generated from Earth alone." "It is not," Nathan replied. "Earth only initiated the conditions." She frowned. "Then what is sustaining it?" Nathan smiled slightly. "Gravity." Several researchers looked almost frustrated by the simplicity of the answer. One finally spoke what everyone else was thinking. "Engineer Brooks, if your laboratory is not forcing the field..." Nathan finished the sentence for him. "Then the field is maintaining itself." Complete silence followed. The realization spread across the room one face at a time. They had spent thousands of years believing gravity could only be endured, resisted, or escaped. Humanity had discovered it could be guided. Professor Zarvek slowly lowered his hands from the holographic display. His voice had lost every trace of earlier confidence. You never built a machine to overpower physics. Nathan quietly slipped the small control device back into his pocket. No. Zarvek looked up at him. You built a machine that convinced physics to cooperate. Nathan gave the smallest nod. Now you understand why we never argued with your equations. They were correct. He glanced toward the star map, where the graceful curves continued stabilizing across the Sol sector. They were simply incomplete. News traveled faster than any fleet ever could. Before the emergency symposium had even adjourned, recordings of the live gravitational map spread across scientific networks, university archives, commercial navigation exchanges, and military observation centers throughout known space. Every civilization replayed the same impossible sequence. They zoomed in. They slowed it down. They searched for hidden projectors, undisclosed satellites, secret reactors, or fabricated sensor data. Every independent review reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. The measurements were authentic. Humanity had changed the way space itself behaved without violating a single known physical law. Across the Orion Arm, shipping companies quietly suspended route optimization software, while engineers recalculated travel corridors that had remained unchanged for centuries. Flight instructors rewrote navigation lessons overnight. Observatory directors canceled planned research projects to devote every telescope to monitoring the expanding gravitational gradients around the Sol system. On Earth, however, Laboratory 4 looked almost exactly as it had the previous week. Daniel was replacing worn insulation around one of the cooling lines. Maria was arguing with a supplier over delayed superconducting components. Grace was reviewing another stack of telemetry reports with a pencil tucked behind her ear. Nathan walked back into the laboratory carrying a grocery bag from a small market near the spaceport. He placed fresh donuts on the conference table. Maria stared at him. The entire galaxy is talking about you. Nathan opened the box and shrugged. They will be hungry while they are talking. Daniel laughed. That has to be the most human response anyone could possibly have. Grace slid another report across the table. The council has already requested full technical disclosure. Nathan looked at the first page before setting it aside. Expected. And, she asked, what do we tell them? Nathan poured another cup of coffee before answering. The truth. Daniel frowned. The entire truth. Nathan nodded slowly. Everything except the parts that could be misused before people understand them. Nobody argued. They all knew the difference between sharing knowledge and handing someone instructions they were not prepared to handle responsibly. Meanwhile, back on Helios Prime, Professor Zarvek sat alone inside his office surrounded by decades of published research. Shelves filled with awards and scientific honors suddenly felt strangely insignificant. He opened one of his earliest textbooks, reading a chapter he himself had written nearly 200 years earlier. After several quiet minutes, he closed it again. A young assistant knocked gently before entering. Professor, several universities are asking for your official statement. Zarvek looked out the window toward the stars. Tell them I am revising my understanding. The assistant blinked. That is all. Zarvek smiled faintly. A scientist who cannot change his mind has become something other than a scientist. Hours later, the Galactic Scientific Council released a brief public announcement acknowledging that humanity had demonstrated an entirely new approach to gravitational engineering requiring immediate international study. The statement carefully avoided dramatic language, yet every reader understood what it really meant. The oldest scientific consensus in recorded history had just been overturned by a quiet engineer from Montana who never once claimed to be the smartest person in the room. As evening settled over the laboratory, Nathan stepped outside with his coffee and watched the sunset color the mountains deep orange. Grace joined him on the porch. Do you ever think about how different everything is now? She asked. Nathan looked toward the fading sky for a long moment before answering. Honestly, she nodded. He smiled gently. Tomorrow morning somebody is still going to have to fix the cooling pumps. Grace laughed. You really are impossible. Nathan shook his head. No. He watched the first stars begin appearing overhead. The impossible is simply what people call something before they understand how it works. Months passed, and the ripple that began in a quiet laboratory beneath the Montana sky continued spreading farther than Nathan Brooks had ever imagined. Not because humanity had built the largest machine or uncovered the most terrifying force in the universe, but because one simple discovery had quietly rewritten the question every civilization had been asking for thousands of years. The conversation was no longer about how to overcome gravity. It had become about how to understand it. Universities across the galaxy replaced chapters that had stood unchanged for centuries. Navigation academies taught new methods inspired by Terran engineering. Civilian transport companies found safer, faster routes through regions once considered impossible to cross efficiently. Rescue fleets reached isolated colonies in hours instead of days. Even planetary construction projects began using controlled gravitational shaping instead of brute force. The greatest surprise was that Earth never tried to patent the idea for itself. Instead, Nathan and his team published years of research, complete with every failed experiment, every incorrect assumption, and every notebook filled with crossed-out equations. When reporters asked why humanity had given away something so valuable, Nathan answered with the same calm honesty that had frustrated so many people during the council hearing. Knowledge grows when it is shared. Fear grows when it is hidden. That answer spread almost as quickly as the discovery itself. One cool autumn afternoon, Professor Zarvek returned to Montana without an entourage, without cameras, and without the ceremonial robes that had once marked him as one of the galaxy's greatest authorities. He stepped into Laboratory 4 carrying nothing except a small notebook. Nathan looked up from a workbench where he was repairing another sensor array. "Good morning, Professor." Zarvek smiled. "Please. Today I am simply Zarvek." Nathan nodded toward the empty chair beside his desk. "Coffee. I have learned that humans solve difficult problems better with coffee." Nathan laughed softly. "That part is definitely true." They spent hours discussing equations, failed theories, and questions neither of them could answer yet. There was no debate about who had been right or wrong. Only two curious minds trying to understand a universe that remained wonderfully larger than both of them. As evening settled over the valley, they walked outside. Above them, countless stars slowly appeared across the darkening sky. They looked exactly as they always had, silent and distant. Yet both men knew they would never look at them the same way again. Zarvek finally broke the silence. "When I first met you, I believed humanity was reckless." Nathan slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and smiled toward the horizon. "A lot of people did." Zarvek nodded thoughtfully. "I understand now. You were never trying to prove that humans were smarter than everyone else." Nathan shook his head. "No, we were trying to remind ourselves that the universe is smarter than all of us." The old scientist stood quietly with that thought for a long time. Then he asked one final question. "What do you think is humanity's greatest strength?" Nathan watched a shooting star disappear above the mountains before answering. "We are willing to look foolish for a while if it means learning something true." Neither of them spoke again. The wind moved gently through the pine trees, and somewhere inside the laboratory, another ordinary workday waited for tomorrow morning. Machines would need maintenance. Experiments would fail before they succeeded. New questions would replace old answers. That was how real progress had always worked. The galaxy would remember the discovery because it changed science, but those who truly understood the story remembered something even more important. The moment that changed everything was not when humanity reshaped gravity. It was when one quiet engineer refused to let other people's certainty become the limit of his own curiosity. Sometimes the future does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the person who keeps asking humble questions long after everyone else believes the conversation is already over.